Dignitarianism by Thomas Quartz. The taxable externality created by unpatented technology within the U.S. economy, which creates a path forward for a holistic approach to the politics of the future. Abstract. This book presents an argument that technology has altered human existence to the point that a new holistic approach to politics that respects human dignity is needed to avoid total destruction that this technology now makes possible. It provides a framework that clearly outlines the power of government and the rights of the individual, while also providing a path forward to greater unity. This book also presents an equation that measures the amount of wealth created in the U.S. economy that comes from unpatented technology, and argues that this creates an externality that is available to be used by the majority of the betterment of mankind. Author's biographical sketch. Thomas Quartz is an attorney who grew up poor and went on to found a law firm that has obtained millions for his clients choosing to sue corporations and to fight the government on behalf of his clients. His exposure to both sides of the economic spectrum has created in him the urge to find principles that will bring unity and balance to mankind. He obtained his law degree at George Mason Law School, his BA in political science at the University of Michigan Dearborn, and his master's in government at Harvard's Extension School. Dedication. This book is dedicated to all of the intellectuals and inventors of days gone by who swam across the dark sea of ignorance to the shore of knowledge and came back with pearls of knowledge which they bestowed on mankind. Since this debt cannot be directly paid back, it is my hope that this book can be a means to pay it forward by leaving a gift for the next generation of intellectuals to come. Chapter 1. Prosperity. What creates wealth, and who should it go to? An age-old debate rages still to this day concerning what creates wealth and who it should go to. On one side, the communists believe that there should be no private property and that all wealth is created by labor, and that capitalists exploit the labor of others in order to make profit. They support government control of the market process to ensure an equal distribution of wealth. On the other side, the capitalists believe that private property is the fruit of labor, and without that, there is no incentive to create more wealth. The capitalist believes that government control of private property is theft, and that a free market is the most efficient and most morally fair way to determine how wealth is distributed. We will examine each point of view briefly. Communists believe that all profit is theft. They claim that all wealth is being created by labor, and it is impossible for the owner of the means of production to make a justified profit. What they claim is happening is that a laborer produces a certain amount of wealth, let's say $1, and then the owner pays the worker who actually produced that wealth a smaller percent of the actual wealth created, for example, by paying him 80 cents and keeping the other 20 cents for themselves. The communist claims that all wealth is created from labor, and an owner can only make a profit paying the working less of what he creates, so profit is always gained by means of exploitation. This exploitation that communist believes is made possible because the capitalist class controls the means of production. Karl Marx has famously highlighted how the economy is dependent on the means of production. He outlined a transformation of the economy from one based on extracting wealth from the land using the labor of the masses to one where the means of production became factories in which the sweat of the masses powered the gears of industry. Marx focused on the interplay between labor and capital. Marx claimed that the ruling class was always made up of those who controlled the means of production and exploited the labor of the mass of the population to work the means of production, to create wealth for themselves by only paying the laborers a fraction of the wealth they were producing. He asks us to reflect back to the Middle Ages, where kings owned the land, the means of production, and the economy was largely agricultural. The king appointed lords to each section of land from his kingdom. These lords would oversee that section and assign the masses of the population, referred to as peasants, a small section of the land to work and live on each. The peasants toiled and sweat to make the land produce crops, yet were only allowed to keep a small portion of the wealth created by their labor. The lord lived better than the peasants, and the king, of course, lived the most lavish of all. The communists asked, why should the king, who does not work the land, enjoy more wealth than the peasant who spends his whole life producing the wealth? During the 18th century, the communists claimed the means of production started to switch from land primarily to factories. This created a whole new class of wealthy individuals, who Marx named the bourgeoisie. This class of individuals had money but no formal power, as they did not have titles like the aristocratic class. From this friction arose the revolutions, including the American Revolution, that toppled the kings and the aristocratic class and replaced them with the bourgeoisie. This did have benefits to society overall, as now the ruling class was harder to identify and thus needed to establish rights in the law in order to avoid being abused. For example, the king did not need a law ensuring freedom of speech. He had the power to say whatever he wanted. In fact, a law ensuring freedom of speech would not benefit him, because it would aid the spread of ideas that could challenge his ruling position. Of course, at times, the moneyed class attempts to use their money to their advantage. In the beginning, this was more explicit, with property ownership actually being a requirement to be allowed to vote in America. As time progressed, the right vote became more widely dispersed. In time, property ownership was no longer a requirement to vote, and women and African Americans gained the right to vote. Today, the moneyed class still hold a disproportionate share of power in the American democratic system. They use their money to lobby government officials to pass laws that benefit them or their companies at the expense of the general public. Capitalists believe that it is not profit that is theft, but progressive taxation that is theft. Capitalists view profit as the just reward for value added to society and the very motivation that makes society produce maximally efficient results. Capitalists suggest that the only reason a product can be sold for a profit is because someone is willing to pay for it and thus finds value in it. In a free market system, all exchange is voluntary, and thus exchanges only take place when both parties find value in them. And thus capitalists claim in a free market system exploitation and theft do not occur, as each party has full control to only enter exchanges that they believe make them better off. However, the moment that government becomes involved in any exchange, it no longer becomes voluntary, but is compelled by the threat of force. If the government passes regulations to violate them, is to risk jail or death for resisting arrest. Even when the government appears to be doing something kind and benign, such as giving something away for free, the capitalist sees a wolf hiding in sheep's clothing. This is because in order for the government to give something, they must have taken it from someone else. The government is not a producer of wealth, it generates income for itself by means of taxation. Taxation takes money from citizens by force. You either pay or you go to jail. Also, taxation adds more steps to the process, regardless of what one is attempting to achieve. For example, if you want to feed someone, the producer has to produce the food, distribute it, etc. However, in a capitalist system, the individual just purchases the bread at the end of the line, and that is that. But when the government attempts to give the individual the food for free, all of the above processes still have to occur, plus step of taxation has to be added. This is no small step. Tax collectors have to be hired, as well as police to enforce the law, jails built to hold violators of the law, businesses have to hire bookkeepers to keep track, and so on and so forth. The cost of these added steps is hidden behind a wall of boring complexity, but the capitalist warns don't be lured to sleep because the cost may not just be in dollars, but may be paid in lives. According to one Princeton professor, communism is responsible for over 65 million deaths in the last century. This book seeks to evaluate how technology affects this interplay. technology has radically transformed our economy, yet tax law in theory has failed to keep pace with this rapid change. This thesis hopes to start the process of beginning to formulate new patent and taxation law in response to these rapid changes. This thesis seeks to understand if technology is creating enough wealth to fund the government through a tax on unpatented technology. As a minor note, it also suggests making all higher education free as a means to pay it forward to the future intellectual class, the externality taken from past intellectuals, since we cannot pay it back. This is done with the belief that training these intellectuals will also drive more economic growth. After this main question is answered, 3 other questions will be asked and answered. 1. Is it morally acceptable to tax the externality created by unpatented technology? 2. Will it hurt or help economic growth if this new tax is implemented? 3. Will the majority of voters likely support this measure? Can taxing wealth generated by unpatented technology generate enough government revenue to be replacement for all other forms of taxation? This is the main question I will seek to answer. My hypothesis is that enough government revenue can be generated from taxing wealth generated by unpatented technology to morally allow for a full funding of all current government programs while discontinuing all other forms of taxation. In order to test my hypothesis, I will first need to determine the precise amount of wealth, if any, the capital controllers are currently obtaining per year, which is generated from unpatented technology, which would represent an unearned externality. To derive the externality, I will start by examining GDP in the U.S. over time, by applying an augmented form of Robert Salow's economic growth formula to it. GDP numbers will be obtained from the U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis, current dollar and real GDP dataset. This data is chained $2009 to account and control for inflation. This dataset was first created when the Department of Commerce commissioned Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets to develop a set of national economic accounts, which was first presented to Congress in 1937, covering the years 1929 to 1935. After pulling the GDP data from the Department of Commerce, I apply Robert Salow's augmented growth model to it in order to determine how much of it is attributable to unpatented technology. When evaluating the years 1909 through 1948, I will rely for support on the calculations provided by Robert Salow in his paper, Technical Change in the Aggregate Production Function. Salow found that 87.5% of economic growth during this period was caused by technological progress. When evaluating the years 1948 through 2013, I will rely on the calculations provided by C.I. Jones in his paper, The Facts of Economic Growth. Jones found that for this period, technological progress accounted for 80% of economic growth. However, in the final calculation, I will accept the more conservative estimate of 80% for all the years 1909 to present. I have yet to find calculation for 2014 to present, so I provide my own, assuming the 80% rate still applies. Of course, even after determining the precise amount of an externality the capital controllers are currently being gifted, it is necessary to then determine the current tax liability of our nation. If the externality is smaller than the total tax liability, my hypothesis will be proven incorrect. In 2017, the Offices of Management in the Budget OMB estimated that the U.S. federal government collected $3.6 trillion in taxes from all levels of government. In 2015, which is the most current data available for state and local governments, $1.5 trillion in taxes. This makes the best possible estimate of government revenue from both federal and local sources for 2017, $5.2 trillion. I have stopped at 2017 instead of increasing to the most current years, as this date range is more typical than the data we are seeing due to the pandemic. Also, it should be noted the precise numbers are not the point, As the government has countless agencies that can provide this information each year, the point is to prove the concept that there is enough money available. The externality created by unpatented technology is $7.9 trillion. This was obtained by taking the GDP in 1929, which was $1.1 trillion, and subtracting it from the GDP in 1997 of $11 trillion. The remaining number of $9.9 trillion representing the growth in the U.S. economy from 1929 to 1997. To determine what amount of the $9.9 trillion was created by technological progress, we will multiply by 80%, which is the number suggested by Jones, and 7.5% less for some years, as suggested by Salo to be purposefully conservative. This multiplication by 80% results in an externality of $7.9 trillion. The annual GDP from the years 1997 to 2017 is left out of this calculation. Leaving out the GDP for those years still accounts for all currently patented technology, as a patent is valid only for 20 years. This is by no means a perfect measure. However, it is a conservative one. The GDP is larger from 1997 to 2017 than it is from any other 20-year period before it. Therefore, it is likely that the percent of GDP created by patented technology is overrepresented than underrepresented, as unpatented technology is likely creating some of the GDP growth during the periods of 1997 to 2017, as a further protection to GDP data being evaluated before 1929. No patent technology is represented before 1929, as that is well past the 20-year limit of patents. However, it can safely be assumed that many of the inventions before 1929 are still adding value to the economy today. The government's total tax revenue is $5.2 trillion per year. In order to test the hypothesis, we initially need to subtract the tax burden and cost of tuition, $5.2 trillion, from the externality of $7.9 trillion, which equals $2.7 trillion. By taxing an externality that the capital controllers have no right to, we can pay all taxes and the capital controllers will still be receiving over $2.7 trillion a year in an externality. This research could be of interest to citizens and political scientists concerned with social justice, as well as economists interested in how to spur economic growth. For those interested in social justice, this research shows that instead of taxing those of us in this nation that earn a living through labor, we as a society could choose to tax an externality that is currently in the hands of capital controllers who have no right to it. This research could also lead to economists to think of ways to invest more in technological growth, as it accounts for the vast amount of increase in GDP. Chapter 2. Definition of terms. Externality. An externality is either a benefit or burden that does not originate from oneself, but is imposed by an external force. An example of a positive externality is when one's neighbor paints his house, and therefore the neighbor who did not paint his house goes up in value as well. An example of a negative externality is when a power plant pollutes the surrounding neighborhood and raises the rate of childhood asthma. In future research, I would like to quote an economist as to the definition of an externality, as I did not create the concept but merely learned it and cannot recall who invented the idea at present. Right. A right is an activity that the government cannot do more effectively than the individual, and therefore the government cannot regulate this activity. Any activity that the government can perform more effectively than the individual is therefore not a right, and the government can regulate this activity. Capital controllers. These are the individuals that control wealth that is produced by unpatented technology. While they control this wealth, they do not own it, they merely have possession of it. Much like a valet does not own one's car while he parks it, but merely has possession of it. Capital controllers own the means of production and pay workers to invest their labor in these means of production, factories, etc. in order to create products as described by Karl Marx. Just as the capital controllers do not own the capital required to be paid in payroll taxes, but merely have possession of it until they transmit it to the government. They also do not have a right of ownership to the externality created by non-patented technology and are merely in possession of it. Chapter 3. Taxing the externality created by unpatented technology. My thesis argues that the capital controllers are currently in possession of a large externality that is being created from unpatented technology. It further argues that this externality should be taxed up until the point necessary to cover the current tax burden of our nation. Even after showing an externality, I will likely encounter two objections to taxing it. One objection will be that the capital controllers have a property right to the externality, and the second objection will likely be that taxing the externality will negatively affect economic growth. In an attempt to best organize a review of the literature, I will break my review into 3 sections. The first section will relate to the measurement of economic growth. The second section will address the possibility that capital controllers have a property right to the externality. The third section will address what effect taxing the externality will have on the economy. A. Economic measurement. In order to measure how input factors, with special attention being paid to the input of technology, affect economic growth over time, it is first necessary to have a clear understanding of what the general size of the economy during each year, so we can track these changes. In the 1930s, in response to the Great Depression, the U.S. government created the first real measure of the overall modern economy and introduced the concept of GDP to the world. Therefore, before the 1930s, it was impossible to obtain the precise amount of the externality created by unpatented technology. Perhaps because they lacked the raw data necessary, or perhaps due to the pre-industrial nature of their societies, it is well known that classical economists underestimated the role that technological progress played in contributing to the growth of economies. It was not until 1870 that technology would really start dramatically growing the economy. The average GDP per capita would increase 17-fold from then to now. Before this period, GDP per capita had barely doubled in over 18 centuries. How dramatic this change in technology's role in economic growth has been is best expressed graphically below. Shortly after the invention of GDP, Roy Harrod in 1939 and F.C. Dahmer in 1946 created the first modern model to measure economic growth. However, built in as one of its assumptions is that technological growth held steady. The model provided a formula for the inputs of labor and capital, L and K, and argued that the main driver of economic growth was capital investment. In 1956, Robert Solow became the first modern economist to provide a model of growth that could account for the input of technology. Solow inserted the variable A, technology, and multiplied it over L, labor. In 1957, Solow would go on to apply this new model to GDP data from 1909 to 1949 and make the breathtaking discovery that 87.5% of economic growth during this period was accounted for by technological progress. At that point, the Harrod-Dahmer model became obsolete. Economists Aghion and Howitt state that 50 years after its publication, the Solow model remains the unavoidable benchmark in growth economics. Upon reviewing the literature, I found that Solow's model is not being disputed by most economists. Often what is seen is other economists using Solow's model and adding new variables to test different inputs. As Solow's model is the most well-accepted model that measures technological growth in the economy, this thesis will rely on it to evaluate datasets. This paper hopes to add to the Salo model. The Salo model measures 3 inputs: L labor, K capital, and A technology. My paper attempts to split A into 2 variables: PA, patented technology, and UPA, unpatented technology. This will allow us to use Salo's model to gain valuable information that will inform tax policy. This information is currently hidden in Salo's undifferentiated technology variable. B. Property rights analysis. Rights are often declared and rarely justified in a systematic manner. I attempt to provide a thorough justification of human rights rooted in the social contract and based upon rational self-interest. I do this by providing an objective test by which all activities can be tested against to determine if the activity is a right or not. I believe that there is no basis supporting humans' rights except brute force tamed by rational self-interest and expressed through the social contract. This may be an uncomfortable position for some to take, but reality is reality no matter how harsh that reality may be. People often cling to a more fundamental protector of human rights than brute force, constrained by rational self-interest as expressed in the social contract, such as God or natural law, because it makes them feel safer. However, this safety is a false sense of security that leads to less protection of human rights because reality and reason are abandoned and replaced with false hope and warm feelings. However, by accepting the true state of reality, we are better able to protect human rights. Once one understands that brute force underlies human rights, one is better able to design a society in a manner better suited to protect human rights. In future research, I would like to list many alternative justifications for human rights and explain why each one fails to offer a more adequate justification for human rights than the one I provide. Preliminary research has indicated that the book Human Rights, The Essential Reference by Carol Devine, may be a good reference. John Locke, in his second treatise on the theory of government, ascribes to the natural rights theory and believes that humans are born in a state of nature with rights that can never be taken away by government. Locke then goes on to state that humans leave the state of nature, where they have absolute freedom, and enter into a social contract to form a government in order to more successfully achieve their goals. For example, in the state of nature, one has complete freedom over their security. However, they can be killed by a passerby, and there is no FBI to track the murderer down. Thus, by giving up some freedom to investigate murders on their own, and by giving the government the ability to do so, they actually become freer, as the government can prosecute the case more effectively. This makes people less likely to murder because they realize they are more than likely to get caught. Thus, the freedom to be secure is increased for the individual. I agree with Locke's social theory of government. I feel humans only left this state of nature to form a social contract in order to achieve their goals more effectively. Locke had all the logical components necessary contained within his treatise to reach a valid objective definition of human rights. However, he failed to do so, mostly because he was a believer in natural rights. I used the premise provided by Locke to arrive at an objective definition of rights. I then used this objective definition to test if capital controllers have a right to the externality created from unpatented technology. Below is an outline of Locke's premise that lead to my proposed definition of rights. Premise 1. All individuals in the state of nature are born with absolute freedom over all of their activities. Premise 2. The reason individuals leave the state of nature and enter into the social contract is to use the power of government to more effectively achieve some of their goals. Premise 3. There are some activities that the government cannot more effectively perform than the individual. Premise 4. Individuals are rationally self-interested. Premise 5. All individuals had equal bargaining power at the moment of formation of the social contract. Premise 6. Because individuals prefer more freedom than less when all things are equal, they would choose to keep any activity that they could more effectively perform than the government as their right, and not contract control over this activity to the government. Conclusion. An individual right is defined as the right to conduct any activity that you can more effectively perform than the government can. The question then, of do capital controllers have a right to the externality created by unpatented technology, becomes can capital controllers more effectively manage wealth created by unpatented technology than the government can? I posit that the answer to this question is no. In the state of nature, there were no patents and thus no incentive for investors to create technology that after 20 years becomes unpatented technology and creates a huge externality within the economy. Therefore, because the government can more effectively enforce a patent system and thus create an incentive for investors to invent than capital controllers can, capital controllers have no right to this externality. As no right exists to this externality, the decision as to what to do with this externality will be left to majority vote. To determine how the majority would vote, a Ross-Lyon thought experiment may be in order. Those in the state of nature would be confronted with the following facts. 1. When the government begins, a new, before impossible, ability to accumulate mass amounts of wealth would occur. 2. A large portion of this wealth would be created from unpatented technologies. 3. The property right to these patents had already been stripped from the creators of these technologies after a 20-year incentive period. 4. Their right was taken away for the greater common good, so other inventors could create off their technologies, thus creating greater wealth for society. 5. These unpatented technologies then will end up creating huge amounts of wealth. 6. These technologies will create a large amount of wealth because they will be the means of production that labor is mixed with to create wealth. 7. Those in control of the means of production will be a small percent of the population. 8. The vast majority of the population will earn their living from laboring. 9. When the government forms a need to fund, the government will also form. The majority will face the choice of either taxing labor or an externality created by unpatented technology in order to fund the government. The majority will choose to tax the externality because it will be in their interest to pay less in taxes than more. And as more members of the majority are laborers than are capital controllers, taxing an externality controlled by the capital controllers will leave the majority with no tax burden. The majority has already expressed their willingness to take property away from one class of the minority to benefit the general good. This was done when the majority put a limit on the amount of times a patent could be held by an inventor. If the majority was willing to take the original property right away from the inventor, it is unlikely they would give a right to this property to capital controllers who have no claim to it. Especially considering that to give this property to capital controllers would be to condemn the majority to pay for the funding of the government with taxes from their labor. The inventor created the invention and thus can claim an interest in it. The laborer creates wealth with his labor and thus can claim an interest in it. The capital controller is merely in possession of wealth, generating unpatented technology and put no effort into creating the invention and thus cannot claim an interest in it. Therefore, the majority will likely seek to tax the wealth of the capital controllers, which is derived from unpatented technology, as the capital controllers have no right to it. This thesis seeks to outline the proper scope of governmental power in relation to individual rights. It hopes to accomplish this goal by creating a conceptual framework that can be used to evaluate any political question based on the principle of respect for human dignity, the right to self-determination. This paper proposes that any political question will fall into one of four conceptual categories. 1. Individual rights. 2. Presumptive contractual rights. 3. Contractual rights. 4. Contractual proposals. By placing the political question into its proper conceptual category, the proper role of government in relation to this question can be determined. Underpinning these 4 categories is the belief that all governments should respect human dignity, which is the belief that all humans deserve equal respect of their natural freedom, and that the only rational, legitimate basis for governmental authority is consent. Above, we see a logical reason to respect the rights of others. However, there are times when it might appear in the self-interest of an individual to violate the rights of another if he can do so without any direct consequence. Below, this paper presents 2 reasons to still respect the rights of others even when it does not appear to be in one's immediate self-interest. C. Analysis of effect of increased tax rate on economic growth. There has been a large amount of scholarly research examining how tax rates affect economic growth. The Congressional Research Service has conducted a review of the last 65 years of economic growth and discovered no correlation between tax rates on top income earners and economic growth. However, McBride, after doing a literature review, has found a negative effect of increased tax rates on economic growth. It should be noted that the McBride review looked at many studies concerning many kinds of taxes, and not just what effect the rising of taxes on high-income earners would have on economic growth. Future research will need to independently evaluate the relation between tax increase and economic growth rate. As a start to this, I have ran a regression in RStudio, looking for a relationship between GDP growth and increased tax rates, and this relationship turned out to be nonlinear, which indicates that the 2 are not related, which would make sense if the main factor driving the growth of the economy is technological advancement. It should further be noted that no one is suggesting raising the overall tax rate, but merely having the highest tax earners paid instead of the working class. Any negative effect this may have on economic growth would also have to be weighed against the positive effect that investment in technological growth producing endeavors would have on economic growth. Of course, even if raising the tax rate on top earners did decrease economic growth, which does not appear to be the case, as the highest growth in the economy was found by the government's own research in the 1950s, when the tax rate on top earners was 90% and is now only 25% with slower economic growth. The workers could decide that the price of slower economic growth is worth not having to pay taxes. Chapter 4. Why be moral? We are often told how to be moral, but very rarely is an explanation offered as to why we should be moral. The 2 most popular moral systems are utilitarianism and Kantianism. Utilitarianism tells us that we should seek the greatest good for the greatest number of people, treating each person as equal in the equation. Kantianism, on the other hand, believes that we must follow the categorical imperative. Kant stated this categorical imperative in 2 ways. The first, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And the second, so act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another, always as an end, and never as only a means. Both have been criticized purely on the application of their principles, by showing the absurd outcomes following these creeds can produce. For example, utilitarianism tells us it would be moral to kill your mother and give her organs away if it meant 2 people could live from her organs, because she is but one person, and you could save 2 with her organs, and all must be treated equally, so that action of killing her would bring about the greatest good. Poor mom finds little protection in Kantianism. Kantianism dictates that if a killer shows up at your door and asks if your mom is home because he wants to kill her, you must tell him the truth, because it is categorically wrong to lie, no matter the consequences. Besides the criticism of the actual application of utilitarianism and Kantianism, One might ask why I should follow your system at all. Sure, you have convinced me that it is rationally in the best interest of all for me to do so, but why should I care about the best interest of all over? What is in my best interest? In essence, why should I be moral? To make matters worse, your philosophers have told me God is dead, and even if he is not, that is an illogical appeal to authority, to appeal to him for support in a philosophical argument. Therefore, there is no objective meaning anymore, and no reason to believe in morality or be moral. The answer to this would be amoralist is perhaps best given in the form of a thought experiment. The amoralist is asked to imagine he is painting a sunset. Now imagine your roommate bursts in and shouts, "What are you doing? Don't you know that all art is subjective and thus you are wasting your time in paint? Throw down your brush at once." You of course keep painting, because the painting has meaning to you, and that gives it just as much, if not more meaning, than some far-off non-personal objective committee would endow with it. Why be moral, you ask? Because your life is an artwork that you are constantly creating, and whether it is beautiful or not matters to you. When a drug addict looks back on their life, for example, they may say to themselves that they wasted it. The same short-sightedness arises when one chooses not to be moral for short-term gain. Looking back on it, they often regret it and realize it makes their life story less beautiful. Becoming aware that one is always writing a work of art each day, whether they intend to or not, may make an individual choose to be moral, even when it is not in their immediate self-interest, because we all wish to live more beautiful than less beautiful lives. Some may fear that with everyone being the sole person giving subjective meaning to their life, that some people may find terrible things beautiful, such as murder, etc. While this is not only a possibility, but a near certainty, we should find peace in realizing that most people evolve to find similar things beautiful and similar things ugly, at least at the extremes, like murdering the neighbor being an ugly thing. As the majority make the laws, the majority will, just as they do now, make laws to prevent extremists from causing harm. While at the same time, this concept of the creation of beauty will provide a reason for some people to be moral more often than they would have before. Chapter 5. Unity. The evolution of humans is a story of progress from primitive to more advanced. This story is best told in 3 chapters: the gene, the meme, and the chip. The first chapter of this story is that of the gene. Richard Dawkins beautifully explained the evolution of the gene in his seminal book, The Selfish Gene. Dawkins describes genes floating around in the primordial oceans, bumping into and eating each other. He states that over time, they started to build shells to protect themselves. These shells became more and more complex, and are now everything you see around you. Trees and lions and humans all share the same 4 DNA markers. They are just arranged in different orders. Dawkins argues that DNA has created humans as survival machines to carry it, protect it, and propagate it. These genes, as Dawkins' book is entitled, are selfish. They seek to propagate themselves at the cost of all humans, even their host body, in the form of cancer-causing genes. However, for the most part, genes will tend to create beneficial adaptations for their host, as what is best for the host's survival often aligns with what is best for the gene's survival. Humans developed in small tribes comprised of people closely related to themselves genetically, and this allowed for the development of altruism, as the genes in the host body were often found in high percentages in other members of the tribe, so it made sense for the genes of the host to adapt its host to lend help to carrying replications of itself. However, the trouble for humanity as a whole arises from the fact that interaction with other tribes was rare and dangerous in those isolated days. Other tribes, being less likely to carry similar DNA, were driven to be more hostile to strangers and outsiders, as altruism had less of a positive genetic reproductive effect. We carried these genetic tendencies to categorize other humans as related or outsiders and to fear and act negatively toward those we deemed dissimilar. These lower urges of aggressive behavior took root before we were even human. They are mainly housed in the reptilian part of our brain. Later, the mammalian part of the brain grew stronger, giving us our emotions, which can be loving or hateful, but either way, irrational. Thankfully, the human mind progressed and developed the prefrontal cortex, giving us the ability for logical thought. However, because evolution is just that, a process of adaptation of pre-existing systems, and rarely a completely new beginning, we had to deal with the leftover areas of our brain that are more animalistic. This is why we often feel at war with ourselves, or of two minds. It is because we literally do have two different parts of the brain battling with each other. This leads us to cheat when we don't truly desire to, or eat that unhealthy snack when we want to lose weight. Luckily for humanity, the prefrontal cortex gave us the ability to create what Richard Dawkins coined as memes. Dawkins describes these as almost genes of the mind. Much like genes, they are capable of self-replication and natural selection chooses useful memes over non-useful ones. Hence, why we no longer put leeches on the sick to suck their blood out and instead treat them with modern medicine and antibiotics. Memes allow us to transcend our genes. It allows us to treat other humans morally, even when it goes against our immediate self-interest. The meme helped unify humanity in a way that genes were unable to. Genes need to live in the limited space of the 26 chromosomes. Memes can live in the near unlimited space of the mind. We are able to obtain the benefit from genes that do not live in our body through the meme. For example, it has been said Einstein's brain has an extraordinary prefrontal cortex, which may have contributed to the neurological substrates for some of his remarkable cognitive abilities. This was very likely due to genes. Other genes make people better at creating certain ideas. Memes allow us to benefit from other people's genes and perhaps a lifetime of work that created ideas which we may not have been able to create, and then we can absorb them in a short amount of time. It is a marvelous evolutionary fact that consumption of ideas takes less effort than creation, allowing a human to enjoy the symphony without being able to play all the instruments. Memes combined with social institutions allow humans to more effectively overcome the selfish pull of genes. Congress, for example, takes individuals from all around the nation, each containing their own selfish genes, and puts them in an institution that is ruled by memes. While it's true that self-interest still plays a large role in decision-making, often in the form of the lawmaker seeking to please his constituents or donors in an attempt to get reelected, this self-interest is now constrained by memes that do not relate to self-interest. For example, congressmen not running for re-election or who have lost their seat and voting while waiting to leave office, or even those dying like John McCain, have to determine how to vote. These votes can no longer increase their personal self-interest, so memes arise or guide the way they vote. These memes can range from traditionally conservative ideas of freedom to traditionally liberal ideas of equality. Sometimes these ideas are more process-based, either procedural or rooted in the Constitution or based on the precedent. Even when a congressman is in a position where he can act in self-interest, he may be constrained by these principles. This may be because he actually believes in these principles and they outweigh the pull of self-interest. Normal voters vote all the time against their self-interest due to a meme they hold, such as someone in a higher tax bracket voting to increase taxes on themselves to provide more services to the less well-off citizens. Memes have the power to lead humans to sacrifice all, including the survival of the gene, such as when soldiers chose to sacrifice themselves in battle. However, if the congressman prefers to violate a certain principle that a meme would dictate, he obeys, he may still be stopped by the power of meme. This power of the meme may be exerted by forces outside the control of genes in the host body. This is one of the saving graces of the institutions of government. They attempt to remove self-interest from the decision makers as much as possible. For example, a congressman in Michigan may want to pass a law concerning car production because it heavily affects his area. However, all the other congressmen from all around the nation may not have any self-interest in the matter, and will thus be guided by other memic principles, assuming, of course, the congressman from Michigan is not trading votes and influence with them, which sometimes happens, but not every congressman can always hold that sway over his peers in every situation. Of course, just the very fact that the congressman is representing other interests in his district and not necessarily his own removes his vote at times away from pure self-interest of his genes and forces him to rely on certain memic principles instead of self-interest. Communication and memes allowed us to go from forest-dwelling small tribes to larger and larger civilizations built largely on memes and less on genes. As more humans gathered in localized regions, more and more complex forms of technology were developed. This appears to have had a compounding effect. For example, when the Industrial Revolution was starting to pick up steam, the steam engine was invented, allowing factories and mills to produce more goods. This allowed for an expansion of the population and thus markets for these goods to be sold in. This increased the need for newer, more effective ways to more quickly move these goods further and further away. Steam trains and boats were created to accomplish this, each invention building on each other and driving the engine of industry faster and faster. Once we hit this critical mass of development, progress has not slowed since 1840. We have seen the economy double 17 times. I refer to this as the age of the chip because we observe a reliance on machines more and more to replace human labor in this age. We saw steam-powered machines replace workers in the fields. Metal cars replace biological horses. We have got to the point where most of us now have an online digital identity that we find meaningful. We use our phones for GPS and are linked into the World Wide Web by this phone, which can answer our questions in seconds, giving us access to memes that would have been weeks, months, or years away before. We see the population's general IQ raising as a result of this, and perhaps better access to nutrition. A large percentage of the population depends on cutting-edge medical science to keep them alive. Almost all of us own cars that allow us to travel great distances compared to our ancestors. We rely on washing and drying machines, dishwashing machines in our own homes. We even have air conditioning and heating machines to control the climate of our homes. This reliance on machines, and in some cases medicines and technology to survive, is pushing us further and further away from a pure biological existence. Our genes are having trouble keeping up. Genes that gave us wisdom teeth, which once added benefit to us because our teeth fell out early, now cause us pain because fluoride added to water in modern dentistry and dental hygiene are preserving our teeth longer and leaving no room in the mouth for these ancient teeth to grow in. Our once starving ancestors developed genes to make them seek out high-calorie, fatty, and sugary food and store it. This is now leading to obesity. Our technology has finally allowed us to map our genes and even manipulate them now. We are quickly rushing into a new era where memes in the form of our values and ideas about what a human should be will dictate our physical and mental composition and not genes. This can already be seen with gene splicing and attempts by companies like Neuralink to implant chips in the human brain to link it to computers and the internet. We have even seen machine intelligence start to surpass that of biological man. For example, chess, long thought of as a thinking man's game, and a game that allowed one to show off his intellectual prowess, is now dominated by computers which humans are incapable of beating. Technology is a tool, and it can be either destructive or productive. Currently, humanity is still living separately and at odds with each other, often being led by primitive genetic forces of aggression. This last century has been one of our most violent. We have also showed that we are willing to use nuclear weapons and gas agents against our fellow man. These behaviors cannot go on for much longer because our weapons are becoming more and more deadly. The march of technology is not stopping, so we either have to adapt or die. The advance of technology and its effect on humanity is not an issue in the forefront of politics currently, yet it is easy to see that the march of technology is radically altering the life of the average man. If the progression of technology is not given the attention it deserves, soon its progression will march right over mankind and stomp us into the fossil record. The disunity of mankind must end if we hope to harness technology instead of being destroyed by it. The good news is humankind has been moving toward unification. Small tribes become villages, which become nation-states. We have combined in larger and more integrated ways. Yet humanity is still broken into different nation-states that see themselves in competition with each other. This us versus them thinking is born from the genetic influence in us that evolved when we lived in small tribes, and it was in the gene's best interest for one tribe to prevail over another. This was a life or death matter for the genes, just ask the Neanderthals. However, now this mindset of us versus them is illogical. The situation has reversed genes, and humanity itself can only survive through cooperation. In order to achieve this, we need to rewrite over the outdated and flawed memes that created the nation-state as a meaningful concept in our minds, which trumps the unity we could experience with all of humanity. The concept of allegiance to the nation-state instead of humanity is widely accepted. Yet at the genetic and memic level, this allegiance is illogical. At the genetic level, the nation-state is too large for your efforts to lead to a payoff to your genes that outweighs the efforts you expended. For example, let's imagine you sign up in an army of 1,000,000. Your actions will not dictate the outcome of a war. However, you will risk your life and spend your time fighting for it. So, from a genetic level, it would be sensible not to fight in the war and free ride off the efforts of the patriots that do choose to sacrifice themselves for the cause of the nation-state. So why do we fight? Because our values, memes, dictate that it should be a shared sacrifice, and it would be selfish and cowardly to sit back while others fought for our freedom. There are, of course, numerous memes that motivate our loyalty to the nation-state. For example, we may live in a democratic nation-state and be motivated to fight for those ideas, memes, in opposition to a totalitarian state's memes. This is a very logical and noble thing, because democratic ideas, memes, respect the fundamental dignity of mankind, and totalitarian states do not. Memes can be logical at one point and then become illogical at a later point. For example, allegiance to the nation-state was logical and beneficial when there was only the choice of nation-state versus nation-state. Supporting nation-states that were democratic and respected the rights of man was logical, and slowly over time drew the energy and allegiance of man, being a logical creature. This is evidenced by democracy spreading steadily since 1776, when the first modern democracy was established. The spread of the meme of democracy, of course, has been slowed by tyrannical nation-states that have either brainwashed their populations into thinking democracy is not good, or just by those states using brute force to oppress it. Yet still it spreads. Just as the meme of democracy, once introduced into the thought stream of mankind, made having allegiance to a totalitarian nation-state illogical, the introduction of the meme of human dignitarianism has now made the meme of allegiance to the modern nation-state over humanity as a whole illogical. This is because the meme of the modern nation-state dictates that each nation-state is to have a military and be in charge of when to use said military. This creates a huge waste of resources. This money could be saved and used for more productive purposes if each nation-state was under one world leadership. More importantly, while oppressing military forces exist on Earth, the risk of total annihilation of the human species remains, and this risk increases constantly due to the technological increases in weaponry. Even a war that does not involve a nation may wipe out that nation due to environmental fallout relating to a war between two other nation-states. As technology advances, it connects us. This growing connection between nations has been acknowledged when it comes to trade and manufacturing. Now it is time to acknowledge the increased connectedness due to technology increases, and not only benefits, but also risks such as those for war. It is therefore time we take a more holistic approach to global politics. The process of moving from a genetic politic to a memic politic begins by realizing that we are more unified and should be cooperating than we are diverse. One must first understand themselves in order to understand their relationship to others. Humans have a dualism nature. They exist as the pure consciousness, that which experiences but does not label in the thinking mind. This difference can be directly experienced by the reader if they close their eyes and focus on their breath, observing how it feels as it comes in through their nostrils, noting how it expands their rib cage and lifts their abdomen, if they are breathing deeply enough. Then doing the same process of observation on the exhale, noting the end of the breath as it leaves their mouth, and again noting when the next breath enters their nose. If any thought arises, the reader should note it and unhook from it by focusing back on the breath. I have provided a link to a guided meditation by Sam Harris that walks the reader through the process of being mindful. Humans often identify completely with their thinking mind, living almost constantly in their thought stream. There are a few problems with this. The thinking mind tends to project itself into the future constantly, worrying about what the next moment will hold. This voice in the head constantly interrupts and interferes with the ability to enjoy the present moment. It's hard to experience and fully enjoy anything if you have a voice constantly talking in your head. This is the reason we disallow talking during movies. If someone talked during the whole movie, it would ruin the experience for us. But we allow this to happen for almost every moment of life. Mindfulness practice is gaining popularity in the West and is an answer to this problem. People often feel at peace when in the present moment and not thinking. Yet our thoughts are often negative and constantly telling us we need to add something to the experience in order to be happy. If I only had X, I would be happy. We imagine we will be happy when we just lose 20 pounds, or find a new job, or find the perfect mate. We are constantly being asked by our thinking mind to sacrifice the present moment in order to work toward acquiring more and more, so some future perfect moment will finally make us happy. Of course, that future moment is just another present moment, and the cycle of happiness keeps on going. On reflection, we know that no magic ingredient ever has taken away all suffering in life. Perhaps you are cold, so you move your chair closer to the campfire, only minutes later to be too warm and have to move it back. And this reoccurrence of suffering and soothing cycles up and down throughout our lives. This may seem like an unreasonable cycle of self-inflicted suffering. However, that's only if we look at it from the human's point of view. Humans care if they are happy, and constantly doing something to make themselves unhappy is indeed unreasonable for them. However, from the gene's perspective, happiness of the human is not the consideration unless it affects the propagation of the gene, which of course is the gene's main concern. Therefore, it is in fact a very reasonable survival strategy of the gene to make its human host never content to sit around, but to constantly gather more and more, because the more one acquires, the more likely they are to survive and pass on their genes. Before genes evolved, the human's prefrontal cortex that allows us to create vast wealth, yet trapped us in a mental prison of thought that makes us constantly feel impoverished. There was a stillness to human existence. A quiet contentment held us transfixed in whatever present moment we found ourselves in. It benefited us to stay put because if we were existing in a location and moment, it meant we were somewhere safe. To venture out would risk the stable state that was allowing the genes to survive, and so they rewarded us with a joyful feeling of contentment in the present moment whenever we were somewhere safe, and lured us into a contentment to stay there and enjoy the present moment. This was before we developed our thinking capacity, and thus were not equipped to compete with all that existed in nature. Yet inevitably, nature found its way into our present moment, and we needed to develop a defense against it, or the advantage of more mates enticed genes to endow certain human hosts with the ability to think in order to venture out and capture more territory for them. Genes have thus given us a loaded gun and the instincts to use it. The question now is, will we use it to shoot ourselves or save ourselves? Genes have given us the inclination to do both. Like Icarus, who was given wings, we have been given technology and the desire to save ourselves and to fly higher. Only time will tell if we fly to the sun of desire and burn up, or land safely on the ground. Genes implanted the selfish desire to acquire more and more at the expense of others. In order to achieve victory over others, genes gave us an ego, which identifies strongly with itself as a separate entity and views those around it as separate. But is this separateness true, or a mental trick played on us by our jailer, the gene? This thesis argues that our jailer handed us a key to escape our prison while building our prison. By developing the capacity for thought in humans, the gene helped create the meme. The meme allows us to combine with or benefit from other genes that do not exist in our own bodies by giving us the ability to share in the ideas of others. This creates a realm where we are no longer imprisoned merely to be the puppet of our own genes. Furthermore, the meme has led to the creation of technology that allows our bodies to alter the genetic makeup of our bodies through gene splicing. We can also extend the capabilities of our limited bodies and minds through technology. We can drive cars faster than we can run. We can use computers to create solutions quicker than our minds could. Most of us carry phones connected to the internet, which extends the abilities of our mind. We wear glasses to fix bad eyesight and go to the dentist to pull out wisdom teeth. Genetic deficiencies that would have killed us before can now be overcome through technology, the frozen material form of the meme. It is likely that as technology advances and we rely on computers more and more, that the effect of genes will be felt less and less. Some even speculate that we may choose to forego this biological body and its many limitations, and choose to live in a more digital, reliant form. The main point being that humanity is moving away from the gene and more towards the meme. Many people chose to put great significance in their genes and the idea that they are separate from the rest of mankind. If this idea is closely examined, it can be shown that unity is much more of a reality than separateness. Humans are at the core a combination of processes and information. All humans share a common process and common information. Dawkins found the gene to be noteworthy because it passed on information from one generation to the next. As a biologist, it is only natural that he would focus on this biological process. However, physics reveals a much more fundamental and meaningful process of information transfer from generation to generation. This process shows an underlying unity to all life. The universe started from a single point. This singularly explored in what has been termed the Big Bang and created all of the matter in the universe. Therefore, it is a scientific fact that we all have the same origin point. Humans often attach great significance to the fact that they descend from their parents and that their family shares the same genes. There is no reason that the same significance should not be placed in the fact that we all descend from the same energy source and share the same elements. In fact, these elements underlie and create genes. The periodic table contains 118 elements. There are roughly 3 billion different genes in the human genome. Just as genes pass on information from one generation to the next, such as making the eyes of this human green, etc., elements pass on information to the next generation as well. But the information they pass on is much more critical than eye color. Elements pass on information about what the very environment that evolution takes place of will consist of and what will be possible. For example, every living form has carbon. If carbon did not exist on Earth, it is very possible we would not be able to have life. Certain genes have advantages over others in certain environments and are thus passed on to the next generation. This is also true because each gene promotes a certain trait, which may make it more or less adaptable to the environment. Adaptability in an environment attracts pairing with other gene carriers, which leads to a higher concentration of the adaptable genes in the environment. The same is true about the elements. For example, some elements can only exist at certain temperatures. So if the environment is a star, you won't find any heavier elements than iron. Carbon, out of all the elements, has the ability to make more stable pair bonds than any other element, and is thus the element most likely to give life a fighting chance. Water, mountains, a more stable temperature than many other elements, and is easier to move through, giving life a chance to form. Water and carbon are thought to be essential for life, and the human body is comprised of 60% water. Therefore, there is no reason to identify more with genes than we do with elements. Both are mindless matter that, when combined in the structure of a human body, help produce what is truly meaningful to us, the human mind. While it's true that we can be attached to our bodies, they are not what we truly feel is us. If we were to lose a finger, we would be disappointed surely, but still feel like the same person. In fact, we do lose a finger roughly every 7 to 15 years, and the majority of the rest of our body as well is replaced. Every single cell dies and is replaced by another, save a few outliers. Yet we still feel like we are ourselves because our mind remains. To understand our true nature, we must therefore examine the mind. It consists of two main aspects. 1, the ego, and 2, pure consciousness. We most often identify with our ego, imagining that we are rich, beautiful, the smartest, etc. Insert whatever attribute you prize in yourself, or in some cases dislike. However, if you lose your wealth, beauty, or any other aspect of your life, you still feel like the real you. In fact, these attributes are by their nature ever-changing. When you were 1, you were not the same ego as when you were 10, or 20, or 30. You may have been so-and-so's girlfriend or boyfriend and no longer are. You likely changed friends and changed ideas you once held dear. Yet you still feel like the same you. Among all of these changes, your pure consciousness exists. The ability to experience persists. This is the one aspect that stays with you the whole time. Most of our memories are forgotten, but the ability to experience the present moment remains. An argument could be made that the ego is the true self because it contains the meaningful things in life. However, an argument can be made that because pure consciousness is the only thing that stays current and being in the moment can be blissful, that it is meaningful and contains the true self. I would argue that both are meaningful and must be considered the self. The ego of one human is of course going to be different than any other humans. When we focus on one aspect of our ego and pit it against an opposing interest of the ego of another human, it can lead to strife. However, if we step back and realize that differentiation is a process that all humans experience, it can lead to unity. We will realize that we all share this experience of differentiation based on different genes and different environments. Therefore, we must rationally expect others to have differences of opinion with us. We can no longer resent them for having a difference of opinion. We can also further this process of acceptance by recalling all the times our opinions have changed. Our own egos have undergone alteration when some memes interacted with it, and so we should never be overly confident in our own opinions or too scornful of someone else for having a different opinion as well. While we may have to solve these differences of opinion, we should do so with fair processes based on respect of rights, which respect and acknowledge the process of ego differentiation and by majority vote for non-right issues. The second aspect of human existence, that of pure consciousness, along with the ability to reflect on that existence, is universal among all humans. Having all come from the same material during the Big Bang, and sharing this universal aspect is highly meaningful. There is a chance given that time may be infinite, that some of our atoms will find their way into other humans after our death, and continue this process of self-recognition. However, even if our atoms do not, the atoms in other humans came from us during the Big Bang and are sharing the experience of pure consciousness and self-reflection. Unity is not just an idea to believe in, where separate humans combine behind some meme, but is an actual true state of existence, both physically and in process. Just as egos differentiate, so did the material from the Big Bang into separate humans, but it remains true that material came from the same place before you were rearranged and differentiated. This concept may be hard to wrap one's mind around, but one merely need to look at their own mind. The brain creates what is experienced as a unified mind, when in fact the mind has differentiated itself into many parts that do many different functions, yet combine to create what is experienced as one unified mind. The same can be true about the human experience. We are many differentiated minds and bodies, all contributing to the human collective meme pool. There is no reason to view others as enemy because they are different or separated, as that is a natural process that takes place in our own bodies and is a beautiful process that allows for a unique experience and a more diverse meme pool that helps us all out. This process of differentiation, instead of being a cause for fear and strife, should be embraced, as it is the key to our salvation and technological process. However, we should also not forget that underlying this apparent differentiation is a deep, meaningful connectedness among all humans. Even hiding in our diverse egos is the thread of connectedness. Our minds are full of memes created by uncountable other humans, and they comprise the vast majority of our diverse ego. Very few of our ideas are of our own creation. And even if they are, they did not arise first and only because of the aid provided by other humans. A great modern scientist, even if he makes a new memic breakthrough, does so using the scientific method created by another. Humans that form any thoughts of note must first learn language. If a human interacted with no one else, he would not form this ability. Let alone he would not even physically survive if it wasn't for other humans' help. While the ego is a real experience that must be honored by the respect of rights, unity is also a fact of existence that must be honored for any existence to continue. Chapter 6. Human Dignity. Human dignitarianism is the political belief system that demands that all humans be afforded the right to be autonomous. The only legitimate form of government is that which the free individual consents to be governed by. It is in everyone's self-interest to respect and protect the human dignity of all other humans, because by disasserting the human dignity of even one human in our society, we risk everyone's freedom and safety. Because the social contract is based on and held together by the idea of human dignity. To deny even one individual his human dignity as an absolute right means that you are saying human dignity is not an absolute right. If human dignity is not an absolute right, then you and every other human have no rights, since human dignity is the basis from which all other rights flow. Therefore, being left with no rights to protect us, the government could do whatever it wanted to us, and so could our fellow citizens, and we could be cast back into the state of nature, thus losing all the gains of living in a civilized society. It must be understood that human dignity is the center of a balance beam. It is the only conceptual tool that can allow us to properly separate and balance what is the proper power of the state and what are untouchable, inherent, fundamental individual rights that the state cannot invade. It is a concept that guides how state policy should be implemented to allow the maximum retention of individual rights while still creating social systems that maximize the effective achievements of man's basic goals. Philosophers have long debated if free will exists or not. Proponents of free will cite the overwhelming sense that we all have that we are in control of our actions. Detractors state that there is no logical way that free will can exist because either actions are random chance or controlled by our environment and upbringing, both of which we have no control over. While this book will not attempt to answer this ultimate question, it can provide some hope for human free will by pointing out that regardless of if ultimate free will exists or not, political free will is an obtainable goal. Even assuming humans do not have ultimate free will, it is undeniable that each human contains a differentiated ego. This differentiated ego, regardless of how its desires become to be born, now operates as an independent creator. Just as a son, while being born from his mother and father, is not merely their puppet, but becomes an independent actor. We can choose to honor the differentiated egos of political free will by creating a society that allows it maximum freedom to choose how to live out its life by respecting its individual rights. Or we can choose to create a prison for the differentiated ego by using political force to invade its individual rights and stomp out its political free will. The question is, do you want to live in a world where every human has political free will, or a world where they live as a mere cog in the political machinery of tyranny? Individual rights. Identifying an individual right is quite easy to do. To determine if something is an individual right, one must simply ask, can the government do this more effectively than the individual can do for himself? If the answer is that the government cannot accomplish this goal more effectively than the individual, then whatever action being examined is to be deemed an individual right. If the answer is that the government can accomplish this goal more effectively than the individual, then whatever action being examined is not an individual right. If the government can achieve a goal more effectively than an individual could, the action falls into one of the other three conceptual categories. A quick example may illustrate the process of determining an individual right. Take, for example, freedom of speech, actually choosing what to say. It is an action the government cannot do more effectively than the individual. As it is clear the government cannot decide more effectively for the individual what thoughts the individual should choose to express. Therefore, the government is prohibited from interfering with a citizen's freedom of speech. Even if the majority of citizens wished for you to be prohibited from saying certain things, the government could not enforce their will upon you, because your right to practice free speech comes from your fundamental right as a human to be free and is not a product of the social contract. You only enter into the social contract with government to help you more effectively achieve goals the government can more effectively achieve than you can individually. You, however, did not contract away your individual rights when entering into the social contract, because no one would enter into a contract to make themselves worse off. There would have been no reason for an individual to give up individual rights to the government, since the government cannot more effectively achieve these goals for the individual. Thus, to give up one's individual rights would have put the individual in a worse situation than the individual found himself in to begin with. Again, the government cannot invade an individual right based on majority rule. The only legitimate basis for this invasion on an individual right by the government is when it is acting to protect another individual right of another citizen, that the exercise of the first citizen's individual right is infringing upon. The government is responsible for ensuring individual rights are protected from interference by other citizens and from interference from the government itself, because an individual contracting into the state of government would not have done so in a way that would not have ensured their individual rights were protected, because it is in the individual's best interest to ensure their individual rights are protected. For example, if someone's religious belief called for them to sacrifice another citizen every full moon, this would allow the government to step in and protect the second citizen's individual right to bodily security by limiting the first citizen's individual right to practice his religion freely. If a situation of conflicting individual rights does occur, the government's interference with the first citizen's individual right can only occur up until the point necessary to end the interference with the second citizen's individual right. The government should not be allowed to preemptively invade a citizen's individual right before he is violating the second citizen's individual right, because up until the point an individual invades another individual right, that citizen is practicing his or her individual right and is beyond reproach from the government. If the government does invade any citizen's right without the justification of protecting other citizens' individual rights, then the government is acting outside of the scope of the social contract and is disrespecting the principle of human dignity by acting outside the consent of the governed and would be practicing tyranny. For the above stated reasons, if there is even a reasonable doubt that the government cannot more effectively achieve a stated goal, then the ability must remain a protected individual right. Contractual rights. The next three conceptual categories find their legitimacy in the social contract. When the individual leaves the state of nature and enters into government, a contract is created. Like any contract, this social contract assigns rights and obligations. Contractual rights are simply all the current laws of our nation. When a law is passed, it becomes part of the social contract. Anything granted in the law to the citizen becomes a contractual right, and any responsibility assigned to the government becomes a contractual obligation. The rights become rights based on the will of the majority of the community and can be changed based on the will of the majority. Again, it should be kept in mind that only things that the government can do more effectively than the individual can become contractual rights or obligations. Presumptive contractual rights. Presumptive contractual rights are much like the contractual rights in the sense that their legitimacy is based on the majority's will. The difference between a presumptive right and a contractual right is that a presumptive contractual right is so clearly in the interest of the majority that it could be presumed that the majority would prefer it to be included in the social contract. This presumption leads to certain consequences. If a certain political question has already been voted on and passed, thus becoming a law, contractual right, and it is also an action that is so clearly in the interest of the majority that it can be presumed that the majority would have preferred it to be included in the social contract, then in order to revoke this presumptive contractual right, the government should hold a national referendum on the question. The reason for this is simple. We want to respect human dignity and the will of the majority as much as possible. However, we don't live in a pure democracy, but instead a representative democracy. We do this because the citizens don't have time to answer every political question for themselves, so they elect representatives to do so. However, a representative can never express an individual's will as truly as the individual can. This difference in interest can occur for numerous reasons, be it influence from special interest groups, or something as innocent as the representative not knowing the true will of his or her constituents. The current system already allows for referendums where all the citizens vote directly on an issue. For presumptive rights, where logic dictates that the law that is trying to be repealed is in the current best interest of the majority of citizens, it would make sense that the revocation of that right should come from a direct vote from the citizens, not their representatives. It should be noted that the more fundamentally the law in question seriously affects the citizen's life, it becomes increasingly important that this law's revocation be put to a vote by referendum. This paper will also suggest some answers to political questions that it believes are currently presumptive contractual rights that have yet to be voted on, and calls on the current political establishment to adopt them immediately, or in the alternative, put them up for a vote via referendum. These are answers to political questions this paper argues are so clearly in the best interest of the majority that rational, self-interested individuals forming a contract would have insisted that they would have been included in that contract, and using the externality to pay for free higher education for all. Paying all taxes from the externality will instantly give the vast majority of the population a huge increase in income. Making higher education free will not only vastly benefit the general population because of the benefit to themselves or their families' educations, but it will also be a way to further grow the economy and cure disease. Considering both of these proposals greatly benefit the general population and taking the externality does not hurt them in any way, it can be assumed that these are presumptive contractual rights. Contractual proposals. The last conceptual category of political questions is contractual proposals. These are the political questions that are not protected individual rights, where it cannot be argued that the government could achieve the goal in question more effectively than the individual. These questions are also not so clearly in the interest of the majority that they are presumptive contractual rights, nor are they current law's contractual rights. This last category of contractual proposals contains political questions where, while it is agreed that the government can achieve the goal more effectively, there is a disagreement as to how the government can most effectively achieve this goal. For example, a question as to if it would be more aesthetically pleasing for one tree or another to be planted at the local park. Any question falling into this category of contractual proposals, the governmental representatives should feel comfortable answering. Chapter 7, Research Methods. To determine the amount of economic growth that was created by unpatented technology during the time period of 1929 to 2017, I start by examining GDP in the U.S. over time by applying Robert Salow's economic growth measurement formula to it. GDP numbers were obtained from the U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis current dollar and real GDP dataset. These data are in chain 2009 dollars to account and control for inflation. After pulling the GDP data for the Department of Commerce, I apply Robert Salow's growth model to it in order to determine how much of it is attributable to technology. When evaluating the years 1909 through 1948, I rely on the calculations provided by Robert Salow in his paper, Technical Change and the Aggregate Production Function. Salow found that 87.5% of economic growth during this period was caused by technological progress. When evaluating the years 1948 through 2013, I rely on the calculations provided by C.I. Jones in his paper, The Facts of Economic Growth. Jones found that for this period, technological progress accounted for 80% of economic growth. Robert Salow's equation is the function of L, labor, and K, capital, multiplied by A, technology, which equals the yearly output. I have created a new equation to split A, technology, into UPT, unpatented technology, and P, technology. The equation this paper presents to split A is N. Total GDP in our dataset this time period is 1929 to 2017 minus N. The most recent 20 years of GDP in our dataset this time period is 1997 to 2017, which equals PN. Pure GDP in our dataset this is the time period of 1929 to 1997. PN is then multiplied by 80%, which equals UTP, which represents the total amount of economic growth created by unpatented technology between the years 1929 to 1997. The pie graph generated from this data below shows GDP as a percent of the cause that is producing it. With patented technology at 46%, unpatented technology at 43%, and all other causes at 11%. In order to test the first part of the hypothesis, I simply need to subject the tax burden. This includes all federal and state taxes, which is $5 trillion, and the cost to make all higher education free, which is $79 billion, from the externality of $7.9 trillion, total amount of yearly wealth created by unpatented technology, which equals $2.6 trillion. Therefore, the first part of the hypothesis seems to be corroborated. By taxing in an externality that the capital controllers have no right to, we can pay all taxes and make higher education free. The capital controllers will still be receiving over $2.7 trillion a year in an externality which would allow the public to tax up to that amount if they wanted to. Thank you so much for listening to the audio version of Human Dignitarianism by Thomas Quartz. It was a pleasure to read.